So we're here to talk about transformation. Sorry, I'm talking so loud. We're here to talk about transformation. And my transformation takes place in the form of my journey from a wannabe Jimi Hendrix to chairman and CEO of 3 of the biggest record companies in the world, but more importantly, from being a drug-addicted college dropout to a pioneer in criminal justice reform. And before I get into that, I often get asked about my day job, because it's a weird way to make a living, dealing with these mercurial, whacked out characters, these pop and rock stars. And so I have a little story that I think really illustrates what my day-to-day life is like at the office. And it's a story about a guy who's in a hot air balloon, and he's lost. So he lowers himself down until he's about 30 feet above this field. He sees a guy standing in the field, so he yells down, he says, "Excuse me, I'm lost. Can you tell me where I am?" The guy looks up and he goes, "Yeah, you're in a hot air balloon about 30 feet above this field." So the guy looks back down and he says, "Well, that's great, but if you don't mind me asking, are you a record executive?" And the guy looks up and he goes, "Yeah, I am, but how'd you know that?" And he says, "Well, because everything you just told me is true, but it's of no use to anyone." The guy looks back up and he says, "Well, if you don't mind me asking, are you a recording artist?" And the guy looks down and he says, "Yeah, I am, but how'd you know that?" And he says, "Well, because you don't know where you are or where you're going. You're in exactly the same spot you were when we first met, but now all of a sudden it's my fucking fault." I was looking right at Chad when I was doing the joke. I couldn't resist. So, my story is a very New York story, New York centric. I'm the son of Joe and Claire Flom, and Joe Flom was my dad and my hero and my mentor, and he taught me so much. And his story is worth talking about, especially in these times, because he was the son of immigrants who came from Russia. They spoke Yiddish, no English. They had no money. And they were so poor that in those days in Brooklyn, the landlords would often give you the first month's rent free just to get you to move into their apartment. So he and his sister, Flo, yeah, her name was Flo Flom. I mean, it's true, what can I say? Like I said, the parents didn't speak English, maybe they didn't get the joke, I don't know. Anyway, so they and their parents moved every month for a period of years just because they couldn't afford to pay anything. My dad went to City College at night, worked during the day, slept on the subway in between, and subsisted on chocolate donuts and coffee because that's what he could afford. And anyway, he never graduated college because World War II broke out, so he joined the Army. And when he got out of the Army, he famously wrote a letter to Harvard Law School. And he said, "I don't have any money, and I don't have a college degree, but I'm the best thing since sliced bread. And if you let me in, you won't regret it." And they gave him a full scholarship, and they never lived to regret that either. That was him lying down on the job. So he taught me and my brother so much. One of the things I'll always remember is that he said to me, "Son, do whatever you want to do. Try to be the best at it, but just make the world a better place." He says, "If you do that, you'll be a success in my eyes." So I was like, well, I definitely want to be a success in his eyes. I want to be the best at something, so I can follow those directions as best I can. So now we get to my teenage years. The only things I was the best at was growing my hair and smoking pot. But I was very good at both of those things. And then I got a guitar. Now the miracle is that I never set myself on fire because, or maybe I did and didn't notice it, the hair grew back. That was, I think her reaction really makes this picture pop. That was one of our first gigs. And so I had these rock star dreams, and came time to graduate high school, which is a miracle I even did, but I did. And I didn't want to go to college. So this was a very unpopular idea in my house, because we've already talked about my father. My mother graduated Cornell when she was 18, which she reminded me of twice a week. And so here was this misfit kid, and my dad had to figure out what to do with me. So he came to my room one day, which was exciting because I didn't even know he knew where my room was, because he was always at work and focused on much bigger things than his wayward son. So he comes to my room one day. He says, "I got a deal for you." He had to walk through the smoke to find me, but he said, "I got a deal for you. You got a year to become a rock star, otherwise you got to go to college." Well, I was like, okay, that's more time than I need, you know, because what I lacked in talent, I made up for in chutzpah. And so he went back excitedly to tell my mom that he had figured out this problem, and my mom, who had never cursed in her life until this particular day, said, "Bullshit. If he's gonna live in my house, he's gotta work or go to school. So now my dad, arguably the greatest negotiator of the 20th century, had to figure out a way to undo the deal that he had just made with his fucked up son. So he made some phone calls. Interestingly enough, Doug Lyman, who's gonna be speaking later, it was his dad, Arthur Lyman, that my dad called. He said, what do I do? And Arthur said, he said, Arthur called someone at Warner Communications. I got an interview, I walked in, high as a kite, slumped down in a chair, and they said, you're going to work at Atlantic Records. It was July 31st, 1979. I walked into Atlantic Records, they gave me a staple gun, some double-sided tape, a bunch of Led Zeppelin posters, and a ladder. And they said, go put up these posters in record stores. Does anybody remember record stores? It was a place for those of you. Oh, it's nice, people from my generation. So that, I'm getting all warm and fuzzy. So anyway, it was a place you used to go to buy records, for those of you who are millennials. Anyway, so off I went. I thought this was the greatest job in the world. $4 an hour, free records, running around. And then I was like, no, there's a better job. I want to be the guy who finds the talent. Well, the funny thing about finding talent is, in order to be a guy who finds talent, you first have to find some talent. So through a combination of synchronicity, serendipity, and perseverance, I bumped into a band called Zebra, a Long Island band actually, and managed to convince my boss to sign them. Their first record was a big hit. They gave me a small office at that point, and then a Twisted Sister came next, and then it was off to the races. And it's funny because my first platinum record was Twisted Sister, and I gave it to my dad on the condition that he hang it in his office, which he did, which was really probably a pretty good conversation starter, whether you had, you know, foreign dignitaries or the head of IBM or God knows who was in there. And you got Dee Snider fucking screaming and holding a bone. But that was our deal. And anyway, so I had more success, and with more success I had more money, and with more money I had more drugs, and I ended up in rehab in 1987. And this was before rehab was a thing. I remember telling my mom I was going to rehab, and she was like, does that mean you're going to come out like banging a tambourine and wearing a smock at the bus station? I was like, no, that's Krishna. That's different. Now, my mom was also the woman, this is a totally true story, when I got my first big bonus check, which was when I signed Skid Row and they had a huge hit. I said, Mom, I'm going to get a Porsche. And she's like, a Porsche? Where are you going to put a Porsche, you idiot? You live in an apartment. And I was like, no, vroom, vroom, you know, that's a true story. So anyway, but I came out, sober as could be, and got on a roll and signed a bunch of artists that I imagine some of you probably had some fun to when you were in your misspent youths yourselves. Artists like White Lion and Skid Row and Stone Temple Pilots and Tori Amos and Jewel and all these different things. And ultimately they gave me the opportunity to start my own company. So I called it Lava. Lava because it's hot and it flows, you know, it destroys everything in its path. It flows into the ocean. I was at Atlantic, which by the way, a little story about Atlantic. I knew it was total kismet that I ended up at Atlantic because I had, after all, lost my virginity at a Yes concert at Madison Square Garden in 1975. So they were signed to Atlantic. It's all full circle. And so we do have the chief judge in the room, but I think the statute of limitations has expired on all these things. So anyway, but that being said, Lava was a really exciting time. We got hot, and artists like Sugar Ray and Matchbox 20 and ultimately Kid Rock and Trans-Siberian Orchestra and all these other artists. And then Atlantic bought my share of Lava and named me the chairman and CEO. About almost 25 years to the day that I first walked in there with the staple gun, they gave me the keys to the place. It's funny because I remember my first thought was, wait, does that mean I get to decide whether it's a snow day? I really had that thought. Very New York, I said. But anyway, so weird how these things pop up. But Atlantic was fine, but I didn't get along with my bosses. And so my tenure was brief. I actually got fired over a poem I wrote, which is kind of a crazy story that I'll share with you now. So what happened was Edgar Bronfman owned Warner Communications, at the time Warner Music Group, which I was a part. And the company had recently gone public and it wasn't going very well. So he was to be honored by the UJA at the Music Business Luncheon. And so I pledged a bunch of money because UJA is a great organization. So I get a call a couple weeks later from some guy from the UJA, I think his name was Stu or something, and I'm like, Stu, what's up? And he goes, well, you know, you gave us all this money. I said, yeah. He said, well, you get a full page ad in the booklet, you know, but it's late and it's due tomorrow. What do you want it to say? So off the top of my head, I said, roses are reddish, violets are bluish. Our stock's in the toilet, but at least we're both Jewish. And it was either the most profitable or the most expensive poem ever written, depending how you look at it. But what I didn't anticipate that people at the lunch were spitting out their food, because you're at one of these things and it's really boring and you're going through the booklet because you're bored out of your brains, and then all the ads are the same, and then juxtaposition is a key to marketing, right? So you come across this and people are literally puking. And so the Daily News ran the poem and that was the end of that. So anyway, I couldn't believe they did that. That wasn't very nice. So, but I left there. I was asked to leave, and I left. And I didn't have a poetry clause in my contract, luckily. And so I was then offered the opportunity to run Virgin Records, which was exciting because it was the coldest record company in the world, and I really was excited about the prospect of turning it around. And at that time, the hottest movie in the country was The 40-Year-Old Virgin, and his face was plastered everywhere. So I decided, rather than run a normal announcement, Jason Flom, chairman of Virgin Records, I would take a picture as him and run that as my announcement. So that's exactly what I did. And it was good that I was 44 because, 44 is a funny number, right? If I was 43, not so funny. 45, 44 is good. So, so that ran full page in Billboard and hits, and then it sort of set the tone, and Virgin was great. We quickly signed Red Jumpsuit Apparatus, 30 Seconds to Mars. We took to new heights, and Katy Perry I signed around that time. And so it was really fun. We merged with Capitol. The combined company was called the Capitol Music Group, and I got to run that for a little while. And then ultimately, the whole company was bought by a guy named Guy Hands, and I left there and started up Lava again. I got the name back in a golf game, and I started it up with Republic, which is the #1 company in the business, part of Universal. And it's been a really fun relationship with them as well, with artists like Jessie J and Lord, and now this band Greta Van Fleet, who are on the verge of saving rock and roll, which is really kind of important to me. So anyway, it was around this time that I realized I was having a midlife crisis. And what does one do when one has a midlife crisis? I think it's a funny term anyway when you're 57, because unless I'm Bulgarian, I'm not going to live to 114. So I got to do that 23andMe and find out. But anyway, but the midlife crisis I was having, and people have midlife crisis, what do? They do like Homeboy. They ski across fucking Greenland and Antarctica. Or they swim with sharks, or they go meditate in a cave or whatever in Kathmandu. So I channeled it a different way. I decided to write a book. And I decided to write a book because a few years ago I became very devoted to African wildlife. And I joined the board of an organization called VetPaw, which is Veterans Empowered to Protect African Wildlife, which is U.S. military veterans who are on the ground in South Africa, arresting poachers, breaking up poaching rings, and trying to save the rhino before they go completely extinct. And so I came back from a trip to Africa, and I got to be up close and personal with these magnificent creatures. And I came home and I was hanging out with my bulldog. We were having, one of our father-daughter talks. Her name's Lulu, and she started giving me these rhino vibes. And I'm like, what are you doing? And she's like, I'm a rhino. And I'm like, you're not a rhino, you're a bulldog. And she's like, no, I'm not, I'm a rhino. And I was like, wait a minute, come to think of it, you have short legs and a big body. You can only run fast for very short distances. You're stubborn as hell. You snort and grunt and snore and fart like a rhino. I guess maybe you are a fucking rhino. So I was like, we better tell the story. So I called my daughter because she's actually a writer, and I'm just, I'm conceptual, I guess. And together we wrote this book called Lulu is a Rhinoceros. And it's really exciting because it's off to a great start, and it's having a wonderful impact on kids, giving them the idea that they can be who they are, not necessarily who they look like or who they're told to be or who they're categorized as. And so that's really, it's got a very strong anti-bullying message, which is very personal to me. So I'm going to be actually signing those books outside afterwards if anybody wants to come and get one. So, and now comes the really important part of the story, which is the transformation that took place that allows me to say, in all sincerity, that for the last 25 years, my priority hasn't been, and still isn't, the music industry. For as long as that, since the early 90s, my priority has been eliminating mandatory sentencing laws, decriminalizing drugs, and ending the war on drugs in general, ending mass incarceration, and which is, I think, the worst failed social policy experiment in America since slavery, and getting people out of prison that don't belong there. So, this all started because of an article I read in the newspaper in 1993 about a kid named Stephen Lennon who was serving 15 years to life for a first offense nonviolent cocaine possession charge. And in case you think you heard me wrong, that's a first offense nonviolent cocaine possession charge. It was in the paper because his mother, Shirley, had been trying to get clemency from the first governor, Cuomo, and she had been turned down in spite of the fact that the judge and the warden and even Geraldine Ferraro had written letters on this kid's behalf because he had accomplished so many wonderful things in his 8 years in prison. So I read this story and I realized I had to do something. I couldn't just turn the page. So I only knew one criminal defense lawyer, which was this guy, Bob Kalina, and I knew him because he represented my artists when they got in trouble, and since I had the artist I told you about, I was calling him twice a week on speed dial. And so I said, Bob, is there anything you can do? He said, these cases are hopeless, but I'll take it as a favor to you pro bono. And 6 months or so later, we ended up in a courtroom in Malone, New York, and I sat there holding Shirley Lennon's hand. Her son was brought in shackles like he was Manson or something. And the judge, he looked like Ted Forsyth. I didn't think we had a shot. But after a bunch of proceedings that I didn't understand, he banged his gavel down and said the motion is granted. And Bob comes over and I said, what happened? He goes, we won. I was like, we won? Get the fuck out of here. That's incredible, right? So he was freed, and that's us outside the courtroom. By now I had progressed to a mullet, so at least we got that going. But that's Bob and Shirley and Stan Lennon, and it was the most profound experience of my life. And I decided I was going to do more of that. So I did some research. I founded a wonderful organization called Families Against Mandatory Minimums. I joined their board, and then not too long, they're doing amazing work, by the way, it's still to this day. It's FANM.org. And then that led to several months later, I was at my in-laws' house and I was bored, which may not shock anyone. And I saw a thing on TV about a guy named David Keaton who had been sentenced to death and scheduled to be executed, and within weeks or days of his execution date, this new organization called the Innocence Project had taken his case, and they found the DNA evidence that proved he was actually innocent. And they prevented his execution, and he was freed. And I thought, that is the craziest shit I've ever heard. I didn't realize then what I know now, which is that somewhere between 5 and 10% of everyone in prison in America is actually innocent, which is, with 2.2 million people in the system, just like behind bars while we're here right now, that's a huge number. It's actually much higher than that because people in jail represent a relatively big percentage of that, and the percentage of them that's innocent is so much higher. But of people who've actually been convicted, it's probably around 6%. So I called up the Innocence Project. In those days, you could just get the founder on the phone because there was no one else there to answer the phone. So I called up and I went in and I saw Peter Neufeld and Barry Scheck. It was just the two of them in a small office with a phone, a briefcase, and a dream. And I said, I'll do whatever the fuck you guys want me to do. I'm in. And so I became the founding board member, and it's been a remarkable 25-year journey with hundreds of exonerations, dozens of legislative changes that have prevented countless numbers of wrongful convictions that we'll never even know about. And along the way, I became particularly obsessed, I would even say, with what I call the second punishment. What I mean by that is, when these people get out, and we see the courthouse steps and the balloons and the media's there and the speeches and the hugs, and then what? They're free, but they're not really free. Imagine trying to get a job or reconnect with family or get a driver's license or anything like that. It's, the challenges are enormous. We're talking people who've been in for 10, 20, 30, or even 40 years, and they're coming out to a world that has moved on without them. And so I started something called the Life After Exoneration program at the Innocence Project and other things designed to help alleviate these problems. And then that led to the logical conclusion, because I like to talk, so I started a podcast. and my podcast is called Wrongful Conviction. Very excited to say that we've recently just passed 5 million series listens. So it's started to really catch on, and it's changing people's opinions about the death penalty and other aspects of our criminal justice system. As I say on the show, everyone that listens is a potential juror, and I need people to understand that false confessions happen more often than anyone could imagine, that there's so much that you have to pay attention to when you're on a jury, and I encourage everyone to serve when you get those annoying notices. So on the show, I interview every week someone who was wrongfully convicted and sentenced to, crazy amounts of time and served crazy amounts of time. Some of them are still in, and I'm bringing attention to their cases. But one of the stories, and every story is crazier than the last one. Every week I go, that's the craziest shit I've ever heard, and then the next week I'm like, no, fuck it. Like Quentin Tarantino would blush. Victor Hugo would be like, no, I can't, stop, I can't, And one of them that helped turn my hair this lovely gray color that I have now is the story of Nora Jackson. And Nora Jackson I first heard about, you probably heard about it too, because this was on the cover of the New York Times Magazine a year and change ago. And she, as you can see, her case was as bad as any, because I think the only thing that could be worse than being wrongfully convicted is being wrongfully convicted of the murder of a family member, a parent, a child. And in a nutshell, I had to have her on my podcast because the story is so compelling. I mean, she was an orphan, both parents had been killed, she had no brothers and sisters, her aunts and uncles had turned on her. The whole situation was dreadful, and she served 11 years in prison before the Tennessee Supreme Court overturned her conviction unanimously, which, think about that. I mean, Tennessee Supreme Court, they're not trying to overturn anybody's conviction, least of all unanimously. And yet, the prosecutor came back and was going to retry her unless she agreed to take a plea. So she was forced to plead guilty to to take a no contest plea. So she was on the outside as a convicted felon. And I had her in the studio, and I was interviewing her, and my heart was breaking in 7 places, and my head was spinning, not least of which because of the fact that she looks almost eerily like my biological daughter. And so I was struck by the juxtaposition of how their lives went so diametrically, in such diametrically opposite directions. So anyway, she's out now. Her story's amazing. I encourage you to listen to it. I will tell you that her lawyer at the Innocence Project, Nina Morrison, who's the head of the strategic litigation, or the head litigator there, told me that she was listening to the story of her own client and driving and had to pull off the road because she was crying so hard. So anyway, I'm gonna start crying if I keep talking. But what I do want to tell you is that Nora is here, and I'd like to introduce her to you and bring her up on the stage. So, and here you are. So Nora has become family to me, and it's really, oh yeah, I wasn't kidding. And the story gets crazier. If I tell you the rest of it, your head will really spin. But I will tell you it, because when we walked out of the studio and I was standing on the street, I was thinking about my daughter Allison and how she had done a play. Now, Nora had been put in a mental institution after her mom was killed against her will. And then I remember that my daughter had produced and written and directed and acted in a one-woman show where she portrayed a woman in a mental institution. And I was like, that's weird. That was about 5 years earlier. So I called Allison. I said, Allie, that play you did in the mental institution? She was like, yeah, Dad. I go, was your character named Nora? And she was like, yeah, Dad, of course. Why? And then that's when I was like, oh, fuck. I mean, the universe is talking. And so we've been very connected ever since. I consider Nora my other daughter now, and that's how we roll. So anyway, Nora, welcome to Sag Harbor.
Thank you.
So the first question is, how are you even here? Like, I'm amazed that you can even stand up and walk in a straight line and like keep a smile on your face. What's your secret? Tell us how you survived this ordeal and what's to come.
Well, one of the things that I quickly realized, I was incarcerated in Tennessee, and the prison population, the jail population there is predominantly black. And I realized that even I had misconceptions and preconceived notions about what an inmate looked like in the criminal justice system. You know, I grew up in a very tight-knit, you know, affluent East Memphis community. My mom was a stockbroker, and I thought that people that went to jail or prison were guilty, and if they weren't, that the justice system would let them go. And I quickly learned that that was not the case. And so I also learned from the treatment from the moment I walked in the door was that they weren't there to just like lock up your body, they were there to like break your mind. And I realized that if I allowed that to happen, that they were gonna lock me up and throw away the key. I mean, they were even talking about, at first, when I was first incarcerated, about the death penalty. I was newly 18, and I realized that, you know, like I had no choice. It was sink or swim. So also there was a killer out there, you know, running around free to do it again. And so I realized that, you know, I think probably the number one thing, like I talked to you about on the podcast, was when my best friend was killed in a car wreck. The only person that could get me over it was my mom. This happened 5 months before my mom was killed. And she was telling me that you go through Sarah, which is sadness, anger, resentment, acceptance, and healing. So I just got like stuck in anger, and the anger fueled me, you know, and you know, anger's not always a good thing, but in that situation, you know, I could, that's all I had.
Nora, in your case, there was overwhelming evidence of innocence and no evidence of guilt. And you know, we know that in cases like yours where, and it's a sad commentary, but the fact is when a beautiful, wealthy white woman is killed, especially in this manner, it scares everybody, it gets a lot of media attention, and that increases the pressure on the police and the prosecutors to make an arrest and get a conviction. But in your case, it's actually bizarre because there just was nothing to go on. And in fact, there was evidence of other people having done this, although we still don't know who. How could they get it so wrong? And what happened in the trial? Like I mean, and there was egregious prosecutorial misconduct, we know that, but can you talk a little about that?
Yes. The person that was my prosecutor actually followed me around to 3 courtrooms. I waited 3.5 years before I ever went to trial, because she used that case as kind of a platform in her rise to power, and actually is now the sitting district attorney, even though we had ethical charges filed against her, even though the sad thing is, you know, I was white, and you know, like nothing was happening to me that hadn't happened to any minority, but because there was so much media attention on my case afterwards, I'm kind of putting the cart before the horse, but long story short, like a lot of other cases started to come out. But the way this happened was that they hid evidence, and they arrested me. So there's like a Sherlock Holmes quote that's saying that you shouldn't formulate a theory and then, you know, use the facts, like bend them to fit your theory. You should look at the facts and then formulate a theory. And what they did was they arrested me before the DNA analysis came back, before the fingerprint analysis came back. And so instead of like waiting for that stuff to happen, or even when that stuff did happen, letting me go, they just decided to hit it, and they slut-shamed me, and they just did total character assassination.
Yeah, and that's an important point. I mean, they withheld exculpatory evidence that they disclosed to the defense 5 days after the trial. It was clearly marked in a folder with her name on it, with like, basically with a sign that says, "Don't tell anyone." Like, I mean, it's that gross. They knew that the only witness against her had admitted that he was high on ecstasy that night, that he didn't remember anything, and that everything that he had said before was junk, because he was rolling on ecstasy, and it was based on a phone call that he said happened, and then they found out that he didn't even have a phone that night, but they didn't allow the defense to have this information, which is a clear Brady violation, which is a ruling from the 60s in the Supreme Court. But on top of that, I mean, there was so many other things that they did that were just beyond the pale. And when Nora said she waited 3.5 years for trial, she waited 3.5 years in jail for trial. It wasn't like she was out going to college.
No. I didn't have a bond. And also, like, I had 3 prosecutors. I had 2 that sat across from the defense, and then my judge was a prosecutor. I mean, he decided before, I think the only thing worse than being a black male in his courtroom was to be a white, a black male was to be a white female, because he was saying, I remember one day when we were in recess, you know, that like I was a disgrace to the type of community that he had always grew up in, and he even made like offhand comments about how he loved his church because females couldn't be ushers there, and that's the way it should be. So he had, you know, opinions formulated early on. In fact, Emily Bazelon, who wrote the article, got one of the judges that shared chambers with him, you know, to go actually on the record, because he was a sitting prosecutor at the time, and he was saying that several members in the office refused to, like, didn't want to take my case in front of the grand jury because in the skeleton file there wasn't enough there. But, you know, in a grand jury proceeding, nobody's there but a prosecutor. So it's like they decide what they're going to disclose to the grand jury. And I mean, you never really hear of anybody not being indicted by the grand jury when the district attorney decides to take, you know, a case to him. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's a mess. It's a giant mess. And the fact remains, and I always talk about this, is that every time a wrongful conviction happens, it not only impacts the people who are wrongfully convicted and their families and their friends and their community, but also the real killer or rapist or whatever it is allowed to remain free and go on to commit other heinous crimes, and we see that over and over again.